Now we're going to look at neurotransmitters and receptors. So the autonomic nervous system is neurons stimulating each other and effectors. So remember, whenever a neuron stimulates something, it does so by secreting neurotransmitter. So we have two different neurotransmitters. Cholinergic refers to acetylcholine. So cholinergic is anytime you are using acetylcholine, which we abbreviate ACH. You may remember this. It's also the same neurotransmitter that we use to stimulate skeletal muscles. So this neurotransmitter is used to stimulate skeletal muscles in somatic. And it is used by the autonomic. So anytime you use the word cholinergic, that can refer to an axon that secretes acetylcholine, or a receptor that binds acetylcholine. And there are two different types of cholinergic receptors. They can be muscarinic or nicotinic. Then adrenergic refers to our other neurotransmitter. This one we have a few different names. Adrenergic is for adrenaline. Another name for adrenaline is epinephrine. And you actually secrete a very similar hormone called norepinephrine, which we're going to abbreviate NE. So throughout the rest of the notes, we're going to use NE to stand for norepinephrine, and that goes back to its other name, adrenaline. So adrenaline and epinephrine are just two different names for the same thing. And again, this can refer to an axon that secretes norepinephrine, or a receptor that binds it. And with our receptors that bind norepinephrine, we have four types. They can be alpha or beta, and then within each of those you have 1 and 2. So you have alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, beta 2. Now we're ready to start looking at the two divisions and which neurotransmitters and receptors they have. So this is our parasympathetic column. This is our sympathetic. Okay, here's our preganglionic and ganglionic neurons. So the brown ones up here are the preganglionic neurons. So these cell bodies would be in the CNS. In the parasympathetic, it could either be in the brain, because remember, parasympathetic uses cranial nerves, or it could be in the lateral horn of the spine. And that would be the sacral region of the spine. For sympathetic, it's all going to be in the lateral horn, because remember, sympathetic comes from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spine. Okay, then we have our axons that go out, and we synapse here with our ganglionic neuron, that have postganglionic axons. So if you don't remember these terms, take a minute and go back to when we took notes on this. Then down here at the bottom, we have our effectors. And remember, there's 3 effectors for autonomic: cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, glands. And then up here where the preganglionic and the ganglionic synapse, remember this is going to be your ganglion. Our neurotransmitters are color-coded for us. So the red ones here are all acetylcholine. So you can see that throughout the autonomic nervous system, whenever preganglionic is secreting neurotransmitter onto a ganglionic cell body, it uses acetylcholine. And these are going to be nicotinic receptors. And that is consistent throughout. So all 3 of these are nicotinic receptors. Then when we come down to the postganglionic secreting neurotransmitter onto the effector, here we have acetylcholine, here we have acetylcholine. And this time it's going to be muscarinic receptors. So you can see that for parasympathetic, it only uses acetylcholine. Parasympathetic is completely acetylcholine. It uses nicotinic receptors between the 2 neurons and muscarinic receptors on the effectors. So this would be all parasympathetic effectors. Anything that responds to parasympathetic is going to do so with muscarinic receptors. Then over here on our sympathetic side, some of them are acetylcholine and some are norepinephrine. And the effectors that use acetylcholine for sympathetic are going to be sweat glands and blood vessels of skeletal muscle. For the norepinephrine effectors, this is going to be all other sympathetic effectors. So anything that responds to sympathetic but is not a sweat gland or blood vessel of a skeletal muscle is going to respond to norepinephrine. So here's the basics of which neurotransmitters and which receptors you have. In the next few pictures, we'll look at some implications of this. So we mentioned the adrenal pathway before, but just to explain it a little more now that we know the receptors and neurotransmitters. So you have some different pathways here. And remember, the brown is the preganglionic. And the blue is your postganglionic axon. And in each of these 4 pictures, this is all sympathetic. Notice you have here your sympathetic trunk. Anytime you see the sympathetic trunk, you know that you're dealing with a sympathetic pathway. So the first picture here, we have a blood vessel of a skeletal muscle, and we have sweat glands. So this is the one where we're secreting acetylcholine. Next, we have sympathetic going to the heart and to the intestines. This is going to be that standard pathway that we talked about. So here, where you have that synapse in the ganglion, you're going to have acetylcholine. And then here, where we go on to the effector, you have norepinephrine. Same thing here. Norepinephrine here and acetylcholine here. And then remember also that up here with the acetylcholine, it's going to be the nicotinic receptors. So right here we have acetylcholine and nicotinic. Then down here with your effectors, this one is muscarinic. And these are going to be adrenergic receptors. The adrenal medulla pathway, remember, is unique. It's the exception. So here we have only preganglionic. Notice you go through the ganglia, but there is no synapse in the ganglia. So we're taking this other pathway, like for the heart and the intestine, and we're modifying it. So here, once you get to the gland, remember the adrenal medulla is a neuroendocrine gland. So it behaves as the postganglionic axons. So here, when you synapse between the preganglionic axon and the gland, that's going to be acetylcholine. And that's going to be on nicotinic receptors. So just like what you have here, it's that same type of synapse, but now we're putting that synapse on the effector instead of between two neurons. Then you're going to get norepinephrine coming from the gland into the blood. So over here you have in the intestine and the heart, you have the postganglionic axon secreting norepinephrine onto the effector. Here with the adrenal medulla, the gland secretes norepinephrine into the blood. And remember, this is what then gives you that wide-ranging response where you reach all of your effectors and that long-lasting response. So this adrenal medulla pathway gives you a wide-ranging and long-lasting response. That's why your heart's still pounding for a few minutes after you've been frightened. That's why it takes a while to calm down when you get angry. Okay, then another idea we've touched on before, but now to give it some more information, is that whole idea of the teeter-totter and the tug-of-war. So remember, we said that with your autonomic nervous system, it's never actually turned off. You can have one side up and one side down, or you can be in balance. So if you have, put sympathetic and parasympathetic on here. So you can have a situation all the way on the left here where sympathetic is high and parasympathetic is low. This would be like an emergency. You're mostly in sympathetic, but the parasympathetic doesn't go away. It's still there. You can be a balance. You can be somewhere in between, right? Like you're mildly active. This one, where parasympathetic high and sympathetic is turned down low, would be like when you're resting. You're sitting on the couch, half asleep, watching an old TV show. The point is that neither one is ever completely gone. You always have both, but when one is higher, the other is lower. So the tug-of-war idea, you have some organs that respond to both. So they share effectors, right? So you might have a cell, and it's going to have both cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. So it might have a receptor here for acetylcholine. So it's going to have a cholinergic receptor. And it can have a receptor here for norepinephrine. So they're in a constant tug-of-war over this cell. The two divisions, so here would be parasympathetic, trying to make the cell do one thing, and over here would be sympathetic, trying to make the cell do the opposite. So they stimulate the cell to do opposite things of each other. A couple of examples of this stimulating the cell to do opposite things. You have your heart. Sympathetic speeds it up. It makes your heart beat faster. Parasympathetic slows it down. So your heart rate depends on how much sympathetic and parasympathetic. So for example, over here, when you are in the emergency and sympathetic is high, your heart is going to be fast. When you're resting on the couch and parasympathetic is the one that's high, you're going to have a slow heart rate. If they're balanced, you're going to have a medium heart rate. Another example is the pupil of your eye. Sympathetic wants it to dilate. Parasympathetic wants it to constrict. So the exact size of your pupil just depends on how much of each stimulation you have. This is important because a lot of medical treatments work by manipulating this. You can take medicines that will either block a receptor so that you knock one of these out of the tug-of-war and the other automatically wins, or you can take medicines that will enhance a receptor and make it more active. So, for example, if you take a medicine that blocks an adrenergic receptor, parasympathetic wins that tug-of-war, and it gets control of that effector. Or or you can take a medicine that will stimulate one of the receptors. So in class, we're going to go over some specific examples of things that block or stimulate the receptors in order to manipulate this tug of war. There are also effectors that only respond to one division and not the other. An example is your blood vessels. So blood vessels are sympathetic only. Okay, so blood vessels can constrict or dilate depending on how much sympathetic. So there's no parasympathetic to counteract it. For most blood vessels, when sympathetic is up, they will constrict. So increased sympathetic will make them constrict. So this is most blood vessels. And decreased sympathetic will make them dilate. For the blood vessels of your skeletal muscle, it's the opposite. When sympathetic is high, they dilate. And when sympathetic is low, they constrict. So kind of think of this as a car with no brakes. You only have a gas pedal. When you step on the gas, you go faster. If you let your foot off the gas, you slow down and coast to a stop. That's how it is with blood vessels. There's no parasympathetic to counteract. You just have them constrict or dilate based on the amount of sympathetic. So in this case, some effectors respond only to sympathetic, and they change based on the amount of sympathetic. All right, so there are your neurotransmitters and receptors and what's going on with those in the autonomic nervous system.